The cold that night in Rockfield, Texas, wasn't just physical. It was a kind of silence that froze you inside. The sidewalks were deserted, covered in crisp leaves, and shadows lengthened by the dim streetlights. Emily Rogers walked home with the slow steps of someone carrying more than just her body. She carried the fatigue of a full shift at the corner bakery, the pain in her back, and a head full of bills that wouldn't pay off at the end of the month. At just 22, Emily already knew what it was like to fend for herself in the world. Her brown coat, worn at the sleeves and with a small tear in the pocket, was more than just clothing. It was a shield. It was shelter. It was protection. And that night, that was all she had between her body and the frost. It was then that she saw him. An old man, huddled in the dark corner of a disused bus stop. No one had stopped there for years, but he sat there as if waiting for something, or maybe no one. Thin clothes, eyes downcast, fingers trembling. The cap he wore was faded, and his old shoes barely protected his feet. Emily slowed her pace. The passing cars didn't notice him. Some people crossed the street before approaching. He seemed invisible, but Emily saw him. Her heart raced. She stopped. She looked down at her coat. She knew she would be cold without it. She knew it was crazy. But something about that scene, about that man who didn't ask, who didn't speak, who didn't beg, touched her. The kind of pain that doesn't scream, but begs silently. Without thinking much, she took off her coat and walked over. The old man looked up in surprise, as if he hadn't expected anyone to see him. Emily wrapped her arms around his shoulders gently and whispered, "I'm sorry. Keep it. You need it more than I do." He didn't say anything. He just nodded, his eyes wet, his mouth trembling. He didn't smile. He didn't thank her. But Emily didn't need to. She turned and walked on, her arms exposed to the biting wind, but her chest strangely warm. Have you ever felt like you were doing the right thing, even though you didn't know why? She didn't look back. She slept that night cold, wrapped in 2 thin blankets and with a strange peace in her heart. The house was simple, life was hard, but for some reason Emily felt she had gained something, even though she had given it away. Maybe it was just the relief of having done what most people didn't. Maybe it was something bigger. But what she could never have imagined was that that simple gesture would touch a man who bore invisible scars. A man who had once been called a hero. Who had known the smell of war, the sound of gunshots ringing through the air, and the silence of those who had lost everything on the battlefield. Thomas Galloway. A name that, decades ago, echoed through the halls of the Pentagon. Now, hidden under worn clothes, he was just the old man at the bus stop. And as Emily slept, he held his coat tightly in his hands, as if it were the only thing keeping him from collapsing. A living reminder that there was still humanity in the world. That night would be the coldest of the winter. But it wasn't the cold that marked him the most. It was her look. The next morning, Emily would wake up to something strange in the air. The sky was cloudy. The neighborhood was too quiet. And a sound in the distance, like tires on wet asphalt. But it was still too early to understand what was coming. Stay with me, because what you're about to discover now may surprise you. And transform something inside you too. Emily huddled under the thin blankets that barely covered her body. The room was simple, the walls wet with condensation that the old heater could no longer contain. Her toes were numb, and her nose burned with the dry chill of the early morning. But she didn't move. She stayed there, with her eyes open, feeling the overwhelming silence that took over the house. There was no noise. Only the sound of the wind whistling through the cracks in the windows and the insistent ticking of the antique clock on the dresser. With each passing minute, anguish grew in her chest. It wasn't remorse, it was something else. An uneasiness that dragged on, as if someone was screaming inside her, and she couldn't translate it. Around 3 a.m, Emily woke up with a start. Her heart was racing. Her body was sweaty, even in the cold. The dream was so real that it seemed to still echo in the room. A man on fire, surrounded by shadows. He was screaming for help, but no one heard him. When she tried to get closer, everything disappeared. She woke up gasping, her hands shaking. She looked at the window. The frost had completely covered the glass. A deafening silence dominated everything. She got up, went to the kitchen, and made herself some hot tea. Her hands were barely holding the mug. She sat at the table in silence, staring into space. And, even without understanding, the tears came. Slowly, silently. As if something inside her already knew that that gesture of the coat had opened a door. Not to the outside, but to the inside. It was as if, for the first time, she had become part of something she could not yet name. At that same time, miles away, Thomas Galloway, the old man with the steady eyes and the bitter silence, was walking slowly down a nearly abandoned road. Emily's coat wrapped around his shoulders with a different warmth. It wasn't just the fabric, it was the memory, her touch, the simplicity of the gesture. And that hurt more than any wound he had ever received in combat. Thomas stopped in front of a small, forgotten chapel, made of weathered wood, with a rusty bell and dust-covered pews. He sat down at the back, carefully removed his coat, as if holding something sacred, and folded it in his lap. He knelt with difficulty. His knees ached, his back creaked, and every movement was a reminder of his age. But he had to kneel, not to pray, but to remember. Inside his pocket, he still carried a folded piece of paper. It was his wife's last letter. He had written it before he died, during the days he was away on a mission. He had never been able to write her back. He had never been able to bury her. Her body had never been returned, but the letter had, and he had reread it whenever he felt his world was falling apart. That morning, in front of the empty altar, Thomas reread the letter once more, and for the first time in many years. He cried, without noise, without shame. He cried like a boy who had lost everything, because he had lost it all. The war, the peace, his friends, his family, his dignity, and in a way, even his own identity. No one knew who he was anymore, and he no longer recognized himself. While Emily slept cold, without a coat, without answers, without even imagining, Thomas slowly rose from the church pew with a single thought. Maybe there was still some good in the world. Maybe, by some miracle, he had been seen. The next morning, Emily opened her window and saw that the street seemed quieter than usual. The sky was still gray, and a thin mist covered the rooftops. She ate breakfast in silence, while her mother commented on the local news about strange movement on the outskirts of town, some military vehicles seen near the reservation. Emily ignored it. She thought it was just routine training. But as she left the house for work, she noticed something. A plain envelope with no return address was stuck to the gate. It was damp, slightly crumpled, as if it had been carefully placed there overnight. With cold fingers, she opened it. Inside was just a folded sheet of paper and a small ribbon of cloth with old military insignia. The sheet was handwritten, firm, ancient letters. The text read, "Thank you for seeing more than ordinary eyes can see. Sometimes a simple gesture can be stronger than any uniform." Emily read it without breathing. Her eyes burned. She looked around, searching for someone. But the street was empty. The rest of the day passed in a blur. At work, she burned the bread in the oven, got the wrong change twice, and was silent the entire time. Her co-workers asked if everything was okay. She just said she was tired. But the truth is, she couldn't stop thinking about that note. Who was that man? Why did he seem to carry an entire world in his eyes? And why, even in silence, did he say so much? Meanwhile, in a discreet quarters at the nearby base, 4 soldiers were opening an old file. Inside was a black and white photo of a young Thomas. Medals, classified missions, and a note handwritten in red pen. Voluntarily disappeared. Refused honors. Last whereabouts unknown. One of the soldiers placed Emily's photo next to it. The image of her putting the coat on the old man, captured by a security camera in an office building. "She didn't know who he was," one of them said. And yet he did what no one had the courage to do, added another. It was then that the commander entered the room, silently. He observed everything for a few seconds, then pointed to the screen. Prepare the team. The decision was made. The bus stop where it all began now seemed more deserted than ever. Emily crossed the sidewalk in silence, her eyes scanning the space as if she expected to find him there, huddled in the same corner, with his coat over his shoulders. But all that remained were dry leaves piled up, an empty fallen bottle, and the iron bench with rust stains. She stopped for a moment, undecided, with the blanket folded in her arms. She stood there, still, trying to decide whether to let him or not. In the end, she felt silly. He felt as if the gesture of helping had been too small, as if she had done too little, as if it was too late. The weight of doubt stayed with her for the rest of the day. Her mind tried to follow, but her heart felt like it was being pulled back. Emily wondered who he was, where he came from, if he had anyone, and most uncomfortable of all, if he was okay. Because something in that gaze, steady but exhausted, wouldn't leave her memory. It was as if she had looked for a moment into a world that no one else saw. A world full of silent battles, of losses that could not be told in words. Meanwhile, on the other side of town, Thomas Galloway slowly pushed open the ancient wooden door of the forgotten chapel. The sound of rusty hinges broke the silence of the abandoned space. Inside, the smell was of dust, old wood, and memory. He walked slowly to the last pew, carefully removed his coat, and sat down. His serious face, marked by decades of sun and sand, seemed heavier than his body. From the inside pocket of his worn shirt, he took out a small metal box, old and dented at the corners. Inside, 3 objects. A Medal of Honor, worn but intact. A black and white photo of a man in uniform hugging a woman with tied hair and a sweet smile. And finally, a letter. The paper was yellowed and creased as old as the pain he carried. He ran his calloused fingers over her image. "She reminded me of," he murmured. The sentence seemed to come from deep within his chest, choked up in years of silence. Emily didn't even know it, but his gaze had broken a barrier that no one, not even doctors or generals, had been able to overcome. The sound of leaves rustling against the chapel window interrupted his reverie. Outside, time was moving on. But inside that old building, time stopped every time he opened that box. Because there were the pieces of a life he had never been able to rebuild after the war. Thomas Galloway's name was in the records, in the classified files, in the corridors of the Pentagon. But outside the walls of the base, he was just another forgotten old man. For years, he avoided any contact. He didn't want thanks. He didn't want medals. And most of all, he didn't want to be remembered. Because being remembered meant being relived. And reliving for him was still too painful. But that day, he took the letter out of the envelope. It was the same one his wife had written on the eve of his last mission. The words, faded, still carried a warmth that was impossible to forget. If you come back, know that there will still be goodness in this world. And if one day the world forgets you, remember that I will never forget. His hands were shaking, not from the cold, but from the memory. And there, in that forgotten chapel, a man who had faced gunshots, explosions, and loss, gave in. He let the tears flow silently. Because only there could he be fragile. Only there could he feel. Emily's coat was folded beside him. He was touching it carefully, as if he were holding a second chance. This wasn't just a coat. It was the first time in decades that anyone had seen him as a person, not as a soldier, not as a number, but as someone who was cold, who was suffering, who was alive. And outside the chapel, parked under a dry tree, a black car watched. Inside, a man in uniform watched through the lens of a camera. On the radio, a voice reported, "Target confirmed. He is alive." Thomas didn't know it, but his gesture of disappearing from the radar hadn't erased what he represented. In fact, he had simply fallen asleep. But now, Someone had pulled the trigger on the memory. Meanwhile, Emily walked home with shorter steps. When she reached the door, she saw a box on the floor of the porch. She thought it was a wrong delivery. It had no name or address. Just a brown bow and a label stuck on with tape. It's not the present, it's the meaning. She hesitated. She opened it. Inside was her coat, cleaned, folded perfectly, and on it was an antique brooch, tarnished silver, with the hand-carved symbol of the Special Forces. Her heart pounded. Her breath caught for a moment. She held the brooch between her fingers, turned it over, and saw a name engraved on it, T. Galloway. She had no idea who he was. But at that moment, she knew something extraordinary had happened, and that gesture, on that cold night, had reached someone much greater than she could have imagined. It was at that moment that she noticed something else. An envelope. Inside was a handwritten note, in firm, almost military letters. "You didn't just give me warmth, you gave me back to the world." Emily leaned against the wall, her eyes brimming with tears. She tried to understand what that meant, but one feeling was already clear. Something was moving behind the scenes of a story that was far from over. And there, with the brooch in her hand and her heart racing, she knew. She had to find out who that man was. That night, Emily couldn't sleep a wink. The phrase in the note still echoed inside her like an unceasing whisper. If everyone were like you, the world wouldn't need guns. It bothered her. Not as a threat, but as a hidden revelation. Sitting on the edge of the bed, with her coat folded on her lap and the brooch firmly in the palm of her hand, she stared into space with the restless gaze of someone who feels that something is about to happen, but can't yet understand what. Outside, the black car had already driven away. No movement, no sound. But inside Emily's mind, the storm only grew stronger. Who had left that note? How did they know about the gesture? Who was that man after all? Doubt gnawed at her more than any fear. And deep down, she knew. That was no coincidence. The next morning, she came down for breakfast and tried to act normal, but her mother noticed her distant gaze, her spoon poised in the middle of her bowl. When she asked if everything was okay, Emily just forced a smile. I didn't know how to explain what she didn't even understand. She felt like she was in the middle of a story bigger than she could see, like she was just a piece on a board with invisible rules. The day dragged on. At work, she forgot to bake twice, gave a customer the wrong order, and found herself staring into space 3 times. Her coworkers tried to make conversation, but she just said she was tired. It was easier that way than trying to explain that she was being watched by someone who seemed to know more about her than she did. Meanwhile, the military base 20 miles away was on silent alert. A hastily called meeting had been held to gather names that had not appeared on public lists for years. A sealed file, marked with a red stripe and the word "classified" in bold letters, was thrown onto the table. Inside were Thomas Galloway's latest movements, with a red circle around Emily's face. "The girl is not to blame," said one of the officers. "But she messed with something that most people have already forgotten," answered another. "He hasn't reacted to anyone in years, but she's cracked the code. We have to act." From the outside, no one could see anything. But within those walls, a silent operation was already underway. Back in Rockfield, Emily walked home in silence. The sky was beginning to darken early in the late fall. The icy wind blew hard, and the trees seemed to whisper to each other. As she turned the corner of her own street, she stopped. In the distance, she saw 2 uniformed figures talking to a neighbor. She tried not to react, but her heart raced. She walked to the door with slow steps, pretending to be natural, but her mind was racing in 1,000 directions. What if she was getting into something she shouldn't? What if she had crossed a line without realizing it? Before she could turn the key in the lock, she heard a voice behind her. "Miss Rogers." She turned around slowly. 2 men with impeccable posture and serious faces were staring at her. One of them took off his cap and spoke in a firm but respectful voice. We need to talk. About Thomas Galloway. In that instant, the world around her seemed to freeze. The wind stopped. Time stopped. Everything she had felt in the last few hours finally materialized into a single sentence. Thomas had a name. He had a story. And now, people were coming to talk about him. To her. Sitting on the couch in the living room, minutes later, she listened breathlessly. Thomas wasn't just a veteran. He was a silent legend. One of those names that never makes the news, but that changed the course of entire battles. A man who, of his own free will, disappeared after losing his wife and his squadron in an unauthorized mission. He refused decorations. He abandoned the military. And he disappeared. For decades, no one found him. Until Emily. "And why now?" he asked, his voice breaking. "Because he said your name," the soldier replied, "for the first time in 22 years. The sentence struck like a bolt of lightning. Emily didn't know whether to cry, wonder, or run. She stood there, motionless, trying to process what it meant. Someone who had spent her life ignoring the world had spoken her name. Later, when she lay down to sleep, Emily couldn't sleep. All she could think about was his face, the way he'd received her coat, the note he'd left under her door. She could no longer live as if nothing had happened. Something inside her had been turned upside down. This was no longer just a gesture of kindness. It was something bigger. A meeting of broken souls in the midst of chaos. The next morning, the city woke up differently. Not because of the weather or the news, but because at 7:14 a.m., 5 dark vehicles drove down Rockfield's main street in silent formation. There were no sirens. There was no rush. Just presence. They parked one by one in front of Emily's house. Soldiers got out in silence. Their eyes were steady. Their steps were determined. They didn't knock on the door. They didn't call out to anyone. They simply knelt. Neighbors began to come out of their homes, confused and scared. Cell phones were pulled out. Videos were recorded. But the soldiers did not move. They did not explain. They just kept their knees on the ground and their eyes lowered, out of respect. Emily opened the door slowly, still in her pajamas, her hair tied in an awkward bun. When she saw the scene, she put her hand over her mouth. Her eyes filled with tears. It wasn't fear. It wasn't pride. It was something else, a kind of recognition that you don't shout, but that you feel in your soul. One of the soldiers stood up. He approached her calmly. He handed her a small, aged wooden box. Inside was a folded letter in firm handwriting, and a golden brooch, different from the previous one, bigger, with 3 stars and an inscription, "For those who restore honor to those who had forgotten their own name." Emily held it as if it were made of glass. And in that moment, she understood. The gesture she thought was small had awakened something too powerful to ignore. Emily stood still for a few seconds. Time seemed to stand still there, staring at the open box in her hands as the cold morning wind blew softly down the street in absolute silence. The brooch gleamed faintly in the pale light of dawn, and each letter engraved on the metal carried the weight of a story buried decades ago. Thomas Galloway. The name now had a face, a gesture, a scar, and a past, and all of it, in some inexplicable way, was connected to her. She looked up at the kneeling soldiers. None of them spoke. None of them even looked directly at her. It was respect. It was mourning. It was a reverence for something that could not be explained in words. And Emily, without knowing how, felt a lump in her throat. The kind of emotion that you don't shout, but vibrates inside until your legs give out. Her gaze met that of the man who had handed her the box. He stood up straight, but his eyes betrayed what no uniform could hide. He was also moved. Not by her, but by what it represented. The girl who had unknowingly offered her coat was now the center of a silent tribute to one of the most respected soldiers in the history of the Special Forces, a man everyone thought was lost. She clutched the letter to her chest, took 2 steps back, and slowly closed the door. The silence continued. The soldiers remained kneeling. Inside, in the still dark hallway of the house, she sat on the floor and opened the envelope with trembling hands. The paper, yellowed at the edges, gave off a scent of the past, of living memory, of something that had survived the test of time. Emily, you didn't know who I was, and because of that, you saw who I still am. For many years, I was a man made of memories, of ghosts, of regrets. The world cheered the war, but forgot the soldiers after the noise died down. That night, in the cold, you gave me more than a coat. You gave me the right to feel like I still mattered. If life gave me glory, it was your gesture that gave me redemption. T. Galloway. The words seemed to warm her chest more than any blanket. She cried right there, on the cold floor of the front door, with the letter against her chest, as if she were holding the hand of someone who had left in silence. Outside, the soldiers slowly got up, one by one, unhurriedly, firmly, and without a single word, they returned to their vehicles. The sound of their footsteps echoing on the asphalt was the only soundtrack to that silent farewell. There was no crowd. There were no reporters. Only the weight of the hidden truth that had finally been brought to light. Not to cause a spectacle, but to restore something broken. Hours later, Emily walked through the town's central square. The looks on her face were different now. Not judgmental or gossipy. They were curious, confused looks, some even respectful. But she didn't want attention. She didn't want explanations. She just wanted to understand what it all meant. Who was Thomas, really? What had he done to carry so much honor and so much pain at the same time? As she walked, she remembered the note left on her door days earlier. If everyone were like you, the world wouldn't need guns. It wasn't just a phrase. It was a code. A key to something bigger. She looked up at the sky, where a military helicopter was crossing the horizon, and knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. At the local library, she asked for access to the county's historical archives. The librarian, an older man with large glasses and a low voice, raised his eyebrows when he heard the name. "Thomas Galloway," he repeated. "That name disappeared from the papers in 1982. They say he refused every medal the government tried to give him. They never wanted his story published, at least not in its entirety." Emily stood there for hours, leafing through old newspapers, clippings, blurred documents, black and white photos, crossed out names. But in the midst of it all, one image caught her attention. Thomas, still young, kneeling in the middle of a field, with the body of a fallen comrade beside him. His gaze was the same as that night at the bus stop. Steady, silent, and broken. She took a deep breath. The truth was scattered in pieces, like an impossible puzzle. But she knew she had to keep going. Not just out of curiosity, but for justice. For the honor he had never asked for, but which was now being returned, piece by piece. Emily came home that night, with her mind spinning in 1,000 directions. She went to bed early, but sleep wouldn't come. Instead, she got up, turned on the dim light on her desk, and began to write. A letter. She didn't know to whom, or why. But she needed to get her feelings out. As she wrote, the window creaked in the wind. Outside, an envelope was pushed under the door. She stood up, her heart already racing, and opened it without thinking. Inside, only one sentence. The time has come. Put on your coat. Emily looked at the closet. The brown coat hung there, clean, as if it had never been worn. But she knew. That coat had a new meaning now. It wasn't just an item of clothing. It was a symbol of everything that had been, of everything that was yet to come. She sat there for long minutes, her eyes fixed on the letter, as if each word had been written in the blood of a story the world had refused to remember. The silence of the house contrasted with the turmoil inside her. Emily knew now. That gesture, so simple and unpretentious, had touched something much deeper than she could ever imagine. But what she still didn't understand was why she was being drawn into all of this with such intensity. It wasn't just a tribute. It felt like a silent summons. That same morning, while the city slept and darkness filled the streets, Thomas Galloway, from the top of an isolated hill in the countryside, looked out at the distant lights of Rockfield. His brown jacket was draped over his shoulders, as if it were part of her. In one hand he held a photo of his wife, and in the other an old locket which he had always worn around his neck, but which he now looked at as if he wanted to say goodbye. His face was calm, but there was no peace. His mind, still filled with voices shouting from the trenches of memory, never stopped. He remembered in detail every friend he had lost, the sergeant who had taken the bullet for him, the pilot who had crashed and burned beyond saving, the 19-year-old boy who had called out for his mother before dying in Thomas's arms. None of this was in the books. No medals had been given to ease what was left inside. And worse, after he returned, there was no longer a home. His wife, although she loved him, no longer knew how to deal with this man who slept with his fists clenched and woke up shouting names she didn't recognize. And one day, she left too. Thomas never blamed anyone. Not her, not the generals, not the country, but himself. That judgment was daily. And that was why he walked away, because he didn't want anyone else to see what was left of him. Even Emily. She didn't back down. She didn't ask who he was. She didn't care what he had done, or failed to do. She just saw a cold man, and she took him in. For the first time in decades, Thomas felt that perhaps there was still humanity beyond the battlefield. This wasn't just a relief. It was a shock. A crack in the thick armor he had built to survive. And most cruelly, he knew he didn't have much time to pay her back. In Rockfield, Emily woke up early, still feeling the need to act. The envelope with the message, "Put on your coat," kept coming to her mind. She walked downstairs with her coat in her arms and stopped in the living room. Everything was quiet, but the air felt charged. Something was coming. A premonition that was hard to explain, but impossible to ignore. And when she opened the front door, she found something unexpected. Standing there in front of the gate was a man she had never seen before. Tall, with gray hair, with an obvious military bearing, and a grave look in his eyes. He took off his hat and said in a low voice, "Emily Rogers. Thomas asked me to take you." She hesitated. "Take it where?" He just replied, "Where he will say goodbye to the world." Emily didn't ask any more questions. She went inside, put on her brown coat, now more symbolic than useful, and followed the stranger. In the car, neither of them spoke during the ride, but the silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was a kind of early morning, of something that hadn't happened yet but was already being felt. The drive took almost an hour. The car climbed dirt tracks until it reached the top of a hill, where there was a simple wooden cabin, with a folded flag resting on a crate on the porch. And there he was, sitting there, with his face turned to the horizon. His eyes seemed to see something far beyond what ordinary eyes can see. Thomas looked at her and smiled. A weak smile, but genuine. Like someone who feels at home for the last time. "I knew you would come," he said. Emily approached slowly, not knowing what to say. She sat down next to him, and they both remained silent, looking at the sky, the mountains, the fields. He held her hand as if anchoring himself. "I don't want the world to remember me as a fighter, or as a hero. I want it to remember the man who was saved by a simple gesture. You gave that to me, Emily. You gave it back to me. And that, no one has ever been able to do." She couldn't hold back her tears, but she didn't try to interrupt him. She knew he needed to finish. "They'll come for me today, but not like before. This time they won't take me to fight. They'll take me to rest." Emily looked around. And then she understood. The car, the soldiers, the gestures, the letter. It was all part of a farewell, but not of someone who was dying. It was the farewell of someone who, for the first time in a long time, felt complete. Before he left, he handed her a new letter and a sealed envelope. "Don't open it yet," Only when they knock on your door again. And without saying anything else, he looked back at the horizon. Emily walked down the hill hours later, carried by the same man. She couldn't explain what she felt, but one thing was certain. Her life would never be the same again. On Sunday, the sky dawned a greyish hue, as if the weather itself knew that this day demanded respect. The main square in Rockfield was eerily quiet. No banners, no podiums, no microphones. Just empty chairs and people standing side by side, waiting. Reserve soldiers, young men from the local high school, gentlemen with wide-brimmed hats and hands in their pockets. Everyone knew why they were there, even if no one had said anything. It was one of those ceremonies that arise from feeling, not protocol. Emily arrived with firm steps, but her heart heavy. She wore the same brown coat, now a symbol not only of memory, but of redemption. In the inside pocket, she had placed the note Thomas had left last, along with the small silver brooch. She wore no makeup, made no speech, and took no prominent place. She simply walked to the center of the square, looked around, and knelt. He knelt down as he did in the face of pain, as soldiers did in front of their home, as those who recognize the silent greatness of others do. The gesture spread like wildfire. One by one, everyone knelt. Every last one. And no one spoke. No one needed to. But in that collective silence, something cried out much louder than words could ever reach. It was the cry of forgotten stories, of struggles that never made headlines, of names that never made it to statues. It was, above all, an act of gratitude for a man who spent decades hiding from his own pain, and who was rescued, not by weapons, but by a human gesture. That night, back at home, Emily sat at her desk and opened the notebook Thomas had left her. The yellowed pages were covered with notes, dates, places, codes. But amidst all of them, she found stories. Small sentences written in a firm hand, as if they were memories scribbled between missions. Day 3. We lost Lieutenant Jones. It was the third letter he wrote to his daughter. It never arrived. Day 11. The Vietnamese boy brought rice again. He smiled even after my hand shook with the rifle. That killed me a little inside. Day 28. I spent 8 hours with Crawford's body in my arms. I was afraid to go to sleep and forget his face. Emily read each line with the care of someone handling broken glass. She couldn't hold back her tears. But when she turned the last page, she saw something unexpected. A sealed envelope with his name handwritten on it. Trembling, he opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a photo. The picture showed Thomas as a young man, in uniform, with a group of soldiers, all of them smiling. And on the back, scrawled in pen, was a sentence. When the pain seems too much, remember, you are part of something much bigger than yourself. The paper attached to the photo said, Emily, you are the bridge between what we were and what the world can be. The day you gave me your coat was the day the silence inside me gave way. Not because you knew who I was, but because you acted like you knew who I could still be. Keep going. The world needs eyes like yours. T. She held the letter to her chest and cried like she had never cried before. Not from sadness, but from something greater. A heavy, deep gratitude. Because now she knew. Courage was not just in those who face war, but in those who see the other, even when everyone else turns their face away. It was at that moment that there was a knock on the door. A manila envelope was left on the doorstep. Inside was a list of the names of those who had served with Thomas. Along with an unexpected proposal, she had been invited to tell their stories, to represent those who had no voice. Emily knew she couldn't refuse, not out of vanity, not out of pride, but out of loyalty. To the truth, to the legacy, to the quiet mission of showing the world that true giants don't always shout. Sometimes they just reach out and warm those who need it most. The journey was far from over. She didn't know yet how she would begin, but she knew she would continue. Write in the comments, silence also carries heroes. If you've stuck around this far, you may have felt the same way I did while this story came to life. That silence that remains after something true. Stories like this aren't just about the past. They're about presence, about seeing the other even when no one else can. And if this touched you in any way, leave a comment below. I carry this story with me. It'll be good to know that you were part of it too. If this video made sense to you, give it a like. It shows that it's worth continuing to bring stories that touch you deeply, without shouting, without rushing. And if you want to be here whenever the next one comes out, subscribe to the channel. There is a video here on the side that complements everything we experienced today. Click on it and continue with me there. The next story also carries something special.